on this computer. Hello, everybody. It is January 19th. This is the OLM working group and triage meeting. On our agenda, we're going to discuss PAIR's DEFI performance suggestion. We're going to go over the existing milestone 2 proposals that we haven't reviewed yet, and then we have discussed 2 front runners in terms of what we wanted to work on yet. So over the week, I quickly put down some notes on what those drafts enhanced milestone proposals would look like. The first one focuses on the distribution aspect of the distribution initiative. And the second one focuses on DEFI and OLM v1 catalog source integration. Cool. So going over, is there anything anyone wants to discuss or add to the agenda? Okay, so we'll kick this off just by looking at PAIR's performance suggestion. I recall Daniel Messer actually submitted this request. It doesn't seem like he's in this meeting right now. So we'll just get to it when we get to it. So I just want to make sure we see where we are with our existing proposal. So we went over the upgrade experience. We've gone over supporting more constraints. We've gone over the direct bundle image reference. We've I don't think we've talked about this one in depth, but this one is we didn't update it to include this one. So supporting cluster constraints, what this would look like would be like, imposing, like you are at cluster version Kubernetes 125, and a bundle doesn't support running on it. Do we want to add the ability for bundles to specify this constraint and accept it, when we're defining how the DEFI solution is going to resolve this list of constraints? My gut tells me we probably want to have this pretty low on the list. I think our first goal should really be, controlling constraint resolution defined via the operator API, but I'm willing to listen, to somebody else who has a different opinion. Does anyone want to share what they think?
I think that particular feature also requires some new code that knows how to talk to the cluster API and feed more information into the resolver. And given that we're also kind of focused on more catalog sorts of things, it seems like maybe that might be too big of a bite to chew off at the same time.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree there. So I'm just going to put it at the bottom of the list for now, simply because it's kind of jumping over some of the stuff we had planned to immediately address. This one we accomplished in this version constraints. What was that? Version range right there. Providing a simple installation experience, that one's already covered. Include tests that prove component versions are compatible. Joe, could we roll this into the simple installation experience or the distribution enhancement?
Yeah, all of those are part of the distribution thing.
Oh, in specific component versions. Okay, sorry, I misread this first one.
I think 3 is somewhat separate, and we probably have to talk more about like where do we put those. Like you can think of potentially having like RuckPack is a dependency of operator controller. So RuckPack, in the context of a RuckPack change, you probably don't it's interesting, right? Like maybe you care that you're not breaking operator controller, but at the same time, like maybe you expect to break it because you know that operator controller currently depends on a version that you already know works.
Yep.
And so like you don't want to just fail tests in the context of Ruckpack if you think they're going to break operator controller. But at the same time, you probably want to signal that they're going to break operator controller. So maybe that's sort of like an optional, hey, FYI sort of test, kind of like we have that Go API diff. But regardless, I think the item 3 there is probably separate and maybe like a follow-on to just like, can we just get everything installed?
Yeah, it seems like once we have the installation process kind of defined in some repo, it's like there's an opportunity to write some set of tests there and then have each of the component repos kind of.
Yeah, I kind of feel like operator controller is sort of the root, right? Like you could almost think about whether we should just put this installation script in the operator controller repo, because the operator controller is, when we run an EDE test for the operator controller, we're going to want to have Ruckpack installed.
Yeah.
So I think there's some things to think about with that, but I don't think it's super important for like, okay, well, let's at least get a script that can install the stuff, and then we can, like we were discussing this, I think in Slack or something, but like the question of where to put that script is still sort of an open question.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so this will just be a follow-up. Then we had, milestone 1 introducing, we introduced rudimentary kubectl operator plugin, install and install commands, and it might make sense to do some more of the advanced features described in the OLM v1 UX doc. I think this might be, we might be getting ahead of ourselves. I think until we actually expand some more of the core feature sets that are offered, it doesn't really make sense to start worrying about expanding the kubectl operator plugin.
So my 2 cents there, Alex, would be that like, so if like say in milestone 2, we go and add some APIs, we go and add some new fields to the operator API. That seems then like a reasonable thing to also plumb through the kubectl operator controller. It's like if we say like, oh, we're going to add a new channel or version range field, then when you say kubectl operator install foo, you might want to also specify the version in the channel on the command line. So in my mind, like I think we can try to just align the changes that we make to the operator API with the changes that we make in the kubectl operator plugin.
That's fair. So write that as update kubectl operator plugin to allow users to specify new constraints. This is really like this is like a subset of this 4th bullet point, which focuses on supporting more constraints. So I'm just going to add that as a sub bullet point. So it's not, so this ticket was originally submitted focusing on, I submitted the ticket. So like raising all the dependency and everything. But if what we're saying was, in milestone 1, we're using kubectl operator plugin in order to drive the demo. It'd be nice to continue to do that for milestone 2. So I added it as a subtask of the suggestion to expand the operator CRD's spec to support more constraints. So once we were finished with milestone 1, DEPI framework. So for bottlenecks, especially with the design, we should make a decision whether it's worth to switch to a generic space framework. So I did follow up with Pear on this, and I do not wish to speak for Pear, but from our conversation, and Joe, you were there too, the idea is not so much for performance bottlenecks as much as it is like decisions we've made that are going to slow us down in the future. And there was a discussion about whether or not we should incorporate some of the generics-based work that Bear has been doing in the DEPI space. And I think our overall feeling is that it probably makes sense to address the workarounds we implemented in DEPI in milestone 1. We should focus on milestone 2 to actually address those workarounds and improve the health of the DEPI framework as a whole. Joe, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think in my mind, at least at the milestone definition level, it's not so much about what the actual implementation is. It's about what we think is going to be most efficient at making us more productive. And so if we think that it's really important that we switch to a different sort of DEPI underlying framework, then because we're going to be able to deliver these other features that we talked about in milestone 2 faster, then that's what we should do. But I guess at the milestone level, I would not expect us to have a core bullet point that says switch to a generic space framework, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's.
And I think Per agreed with that, right?
Yeah, and when we look at the, we on the agenda, we have these like proposed milestones that we want to discuss. I think when we actually get to those, it will become much more apparent what this is going to look like. It's kind of based around. Yep.
Sorry, Alex, go ahead. I'll follow after you're done.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think this comment about like just doing some of the cleanup now so that we keep our speed, our velocity up, it makes a lot more sense when you see like what the proposed focuses for the next milestone are. So Varsha, what's up?
So I had a question on milestone 1. Since we were on the topic, it's not directly related to DEPI, but on how do we define that milestone 1 is done and the end product of milestone? Because my understanding is milestone 1 is kind of something which tells the user that we are able to install and uninstall a particular operator, the 2 operators. And like I remember you showed this issue on it. But the question was, for the milestone 1, do we intend to have an end-to-end script just so that someone who is new to OLM can go ahead, use the script, have cert manager, ruckpack installed, call an operator API, get something running to install CockroachDB and Prometheus from the starting till the end? So can that be an inclusion of milestone 1, or are we putting that to milestone 2?
Yeah, so what I'd like to see for that, and people can change what the acceptance criteria is, I don't think we're going to have like, what we'll have to do in order to showcase that is get the operator controller to a point where it can actually create the operator CR, especially specify the CockroachDB and the Prometheus operators and see them installed on cluster, right? I think having some sample YAML that you apply and show that the, after installing operator controller and all the dependents, and remember, we don't have the distribution story done yet, so it's going to be a bit lengthy. It's going to be like apply this, install this component, install this component, install this component, and then run this, create these operator CRs and see that everything gets installed. I'm fine with that being a README. I'm fine with that being an ASCII Cinema demo. And then from there, I think the story then becomes, as part of our distribution process, and we're cutting releases, we're versioning everything. Where are we going to keep the demos for the milestones, right? So, we create these milestone tickets. It might make sense to, basically have a little thing that describes a summary of the demo, kind of like what we do here, and then like have the embedded ASCII demo, and then like a link to install the version where the demo is available, and then like the steps to reproduce the demo. And that way we have like, here's the ask, here's the release, and then here's a video of the release, and then here's how you install it and play around with it on your own. And that the actual release, which will be a GitHub release, we should probably consider calling out the the major changes of the release, and then like just kind of showcasing them using that same demo. But I haven't thought about it too closely in terms of how we're going to hard code those acceptance criteria.
Yep, this is the reason I was asking if that's the case. Will it be nice to create an issue about it? Because in my previous experience with another project, that is KCP, whenever a milestone was done, we had kind of a demo for users who don't have an idea about the project, who know that it's breaking and it'll change, but just can go around, use a script, play around and see how things work to get a community attention. So will that be a reasonable issue to add in milestone 1? That's my question, but yeah, that sounds good.
I think I'm for that. Do we want to make a new ticket, or do we just want to append it to the existing enhancement milestone issue?
I can add in acceptance criteria to the milestone 1, and if needed, I can create an issue and refer it here. I can do the background work of adding that here.
I kind of like adding it to the acceptance criteria here, because then you don't have to find the demo ticket related to milestone 1. But how does everyone else feel about that? Any complaints? Do people like to see a separate ticket?
I think a ticket, well, I don't think we need a separate ticket that documents that we've done the demo and here it is. Like, it makes a lot of sense to me that we could make a new issue under milestone 1 that says we need to make sure that we cut a release and that we build the demo and blah blah blah. And then we can just on this issue at the end, before we close it, we can say, okay, here's the demo script, here's the demo video, here's the release script, here's the demo steps that we followed, close.
I see.
But I don't know if it, sorry, Alex.
No, I was just saying, like, just update. Something like that, right? And then it's just you're updating. It's OLM being milestone ticket.
Yeah, honestly, like, I kind of feel like it's, yeah, I don't know, that maybe that seems reasonable. I don't know if anybody else has ideas, but like, essentially what we want to make sure we do is every time there's a milestone, we go and tell people about our milestone and prove that we've done it and close the issue out. So I don't know if that's just implicit or if we need to make sure that we write the ticket for it, but whatever works for people, I think makes sense.
Yeah, so I just wrote it really small, just update the epic to have include a demo recording and steps to install the demo locally. Install and run the demo locally.
Do we need a script too that just goes over doing installation of Ruckpack and all the dependencies?
Barsha, my suggestion would just be, we need a bash script or a shell script that does the install, maybe, although that's funny because that starts to get into milestone 2 a little bit. Maybe what I would say is, like, what steps did we follow in just a README sort of format to do the demo? And so if that just means like, okay, step 1 is kubectl apply this, and then step 2 is kubectl apply that. I don't think we need a shell script that has that stuff. I just think we need to write down what our steps were such that someone else could reproduce it.
Okay.
But if you want to make a script and you want to do an ASCII cinema or whatever else, like, even that's just icing on the cake, I think.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just gonna say record steps to install and run the demo locally. And then I just like included like example, step 1, run this component, step 2, run this, run this, run this. Oh, interesting. What project do we want this in? Enhancements? Okay, so we'll just put in enhancements because it involves updating it. Varsha, do you want to be the one who does this?
Sure.
Cool. Good. Labels OLM. Milestone 1. Okay. Cool. So going back to the proposal for milestone 2, it's just agreeing with that. We just went over this one. Oh, this is more in-depth response, but hey, we're through all the submissions. And so what we see at the very top after reviewing all the submissions for milestone 2 is that we want to define how we distribute this stuff. We want to this has changed slightly with additional conversation, which we can kind of cover when we look at the proposed enhancements that we spun up that we'll look at after this. And we were talking about 3 being important, but based on some of the discussions we have had, I think we're going to move 4 up in terms of importance. And if any, does anyone feel strongly that we should work on supporting upgrades before we support additional constraints?
Daniel is not here to represent his opinion, but I will-ish. He put a comment that he wanted to see upgrades. I don't know if that's enough to make us want to do that instead of the constraint stuff. Honestly, I don't think it matters that much. It's all like, honestly, 3 and 4 are just different sorts of constraint implementations. So in my opinion, it doesn't matter all that much.
Yeah, I kind of like doing 4 a little bit more than 3 for right now, because we like, out of the box at the end of milestone 1, we will have some degree of support for upgrading, right? Even if it involves like uninstalling and reinstalling, like that's technically an upgrade. But the like there's a lot of open questions in terms of how we handle upgrades safely that I'd like to push off until we have a more well-defined like there's a lot of architecture, like
Well,
there's a
I
bunch
think
of architecture discussion that can be born out of 3.
there will be for sure. I think what I would probably say, regardless of when we do it, is the first thing we do for 3 is we only will upgrade along defined upgrade edges first. And then we'll talk about all the other, we've had a bunch of other conversations recently about like, well, what if you don't want that and you're a cluster admin? Okay, well, that just means like more features then that let you opt out of only choosing upgrade paths. But that one is a little bit different. I think that one is like, it has more to it, right? The channel and version are, once we have those implemented, that pretty much is done. Like that pretty much just works.
Yeah.
The upgrade one, there's a lot to it. There's the force stuff. There's the when can I upgrade? There's just knowing what's even installed and looking at bundle deployments and mapping those back. There's a whole bunch of extra stuff with the upgrade one that we don't have to all tackle at once, but maybe it might be better to like pick off this low-hanging constraint fruit. And then we do upgrade iteration 1 and then immediately follow that with iteration 2. And then we can kind of focus more on that side of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was going to agree with you, Joe, in that it basically, the upgrade stuff can be iterative with, additional requirements and challenges added later. So, yeah.
I personally don't have an opinion if we're going to do the simple upgrade story before we do the version and channel story. Like, I don't care about that, but regardless, there's going to be way more follow on for the upgrade stories.
Yeah. I think we almost get this for free with the version constraints, right? Because we can create one operator CR that says install this operator version. And then you just change the version to the next version and an upgrade should happen. So maybe we add it as a stretch goal to this.
Yeah, so in my mind, it's not about actually the mechanics of pivoting from one version to another. That will happen regardless, even as part of 3, I think.
Mm-hmm.
What what the upgrade story is about is really following the operator author defined upgrade graph. Like that's the thing that's interesting and new. But just like simple pivoting from what was there before to what's there now, that I think we're going to already have. So if you think that like that is already upgrade sort of, but it's just not upgrade that the operator author can tell you to do. And also, like, I would expect that if we do the version range constraint without doing the follow upgrade edges, that also means we're going to allow downgrades, no problem, because you can say at time 0, I want version 3, and then at time 1, I want version 2. And as long as the resolver says, yeah, that'll work too, then it'll downgrade, which I think is fine, but that's just, it's just like another sort of facet to the whole pivoting story, I think.
Right.
I've got to drop, but one thing I wanted to talk about really quick with the distribution story. So down at the bottom of this issue, I left some comments about some ideas that I had where we could have like a descriptive file. It's like a manifest file. I just posted this in the Slack channel, but I think we can probably skip over that for now. Todd and I were talking yesterday about like, how can we make this simple? But I think I'd probably suggest now, having talked about it, is let's just have an install script that does the install and just exposes the manifests that we want to apply for each subcomponent as environment variables that have defaults, but then can also be overridden. So that way, like if you can, like we just keep that up to date for every release of the OLM v1. And then when we tag that, that branch or whatever, that install script just works if you take the defaults. But if you're, some subcomponent and you want to use your new version of the manifest, then you can set an environment variable, which would override your manifest and then run the install script. So that would be a lot easier than I think this idea of like, oh, let's have a subcomponent manifest file and let's parse it. Like that, I think starts to get maybe more complicated than we need. So at least my suggestion, having thought about this more and talked about it, is just write up a script that does the install. And that means we can have a little bit more logic too, right? We can do weights and certain, like we can do different stuff that's not just loop through this thing and kubectl apply it. So I think that gives us more flexibility.
Okay, seems reasonable. Okay, so but before you go, we just want to redesign 4 so it's like OLM adheres to upgrade edges defined by operator authors, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say that. Yeah. All right, I gotta go, guys. Have a good one. I'll be back a little bit later. This is just a short errand.
Okay, cool. So this is the entire list of stuff that was proposed by the upstream community. So I think that, so I went through this on my own and I thought it was reasonable to basically do 1, 2, and what is now 3 in the next milestone. So after we get our OLM v1 milestone 1 end-to-end workflow done, this work would make sense to start doing. And I'll update the agenda meeting to include the links to the proposed milestones. I'll get this one right. Oops. So if anybody wants to look at this themselves, you can just go to the agenda now. But I was looking at this work, and we had the story about like we want to be able to basically distribute and install a official set of components that define like OLM at each milestone or each major release. And so I thought that would make sense to have its own milestone And then largely because the second set of stuff that we were considering doing, which is like basically, we need to rephrase this a little bit, but like moving out some of the hard-coded stuff out of DEPI and then moving to that general constraints model or generic constraints. Updating DEPI to use generics. That stuff could allow us to like take more types of sources in, and then finally we have once we can accept source content from different types of sources. Oh geez, wait, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I kind of messed that up. So this one, number 2, is actually focused on updating DEPI to integrate with the next generation catalog source API. So what work would be involved there? It's pretty, we made a decision in milestone 1 to pivot from using registry v1 catalog sources and instead using a hard-coded list of entities right now. And so what this work would kind of be reformed to is like update DEPI so that we can accept content from, non-hard-coded sources. That'd be like the registry v1 work and the catalog sources that ONIC is currently working on. And then the second story would just be expanding the number of constraints that are supported by the operator's CR, which involves some work on DEPI as well. And so I coupled those 2 stories into milestone 2B. And you can kind of read about that here, and we can go over this in a second. And the other milestone I created is a distribution epic, which doesn't really depend on DEPI being updated to support non-hard-coded, catalog sources. Does anyone have any major objections with that approach? My idea is that like we could work on the distribution as one milestone while concurrently working on the, updating DEPI to accept stuff from a real catalog source. Very quiet in here.
I have no objections.
Okay, cool. We got one.
You can add me to that list too. Makes sense to me.
Fantastic. That's about as close as consensus as I think we need.
Nice.
If anyone feels strongly otherwise, just please speak up. Okay, so let's quickly go over like what the distribution epic milestone might look like, and then we can wordsmith this a little bit together. And then we can start looking at milestone 2. I did my best to kind of define what we want to do within the DEPI side of frame of things. And then there's like, more of an open conversation as to what we are doing in catalog source. I just made this placeholder other stories here. And that's something I was hoping that ONIC and Catherine might be able to start filling out. But let's kick this off by looking at this proposed milestone, which focuses on OLM v1 release distribution. Do you guys want me to read through it and then we can just speak at each piece, or do you want a minute to read through it yourself?
Could you send that link to the doc in chat?
Yep. You can add comments as you want. I'm gonna just kind of walk us through what this milestone suggests. So milestone 2A. So this milestone basically focuses as cluster admin. I want to be able to kubectl apply a release version of OLM v1. That is the goal of this epic. We actually, just based on what Joe had just said, I want to be able to install a release version of OLM v1 with a single command. Yep, there we go. Cool. So why are we doing this? The goal of this milestone is to make it easy to create and distribute an official OLM v1 release. As you may know, OLM v1 experience is powered by a few sub-projects. We've got the operator controller, we've got RuckBack, and Cert Manager is a dependency of RuckBack, so it will likely be pulled in as a dependency for the operator controller. So I threw that in there. And then finally, if we get all the catalog source v1 stuff completed and working, we need to update the distribution process to actually incorporate that as well. So if we get to the point where we're able to cut a release, a release version of OLM for the catalog, the new catalog source API and controllers are implemented, we can probably skip this. So I marked it as non-blocking. Reasons for doing this is because making it easier for developers to map an OLM v1 release to pin versions of the sub projects is going to promote frequent releases. And it's also going to make it easy for us to install and test the release, and which will help us distribute it, help us get adoption, and solicit feedback.
As part of deciding this release distribution, are we going to be talking about release cadence too, or yeah, because for example, in OLM v0, we still had some sort of, although it wasn't exactly this, where the distribution of OLM is coming from different repositories and different releases will be tied in together, but still there were instances where, for example, the API repo needed multiple releases, had multiple releases just to incorporate into, for example, opera registry, and then OLM had to be updated subsequently. Essentially, what I'm getting at is we did not have any release cycle or even a release cadence. Are we deciding that? Are we going to be deciding anything of that sort as a part of this milestone? And the thing that I have in mind, as for example, is Kubernetes does a lot of releases. Whenever it does a release, all of the related projects also have the same release version. Are we thinking that we'll be sticking to, or even deciding a release cadence for ourselves, and we'll be deciding that in this milestone, or is that just for a future discussion?
That's a good question. I had envisioned that right now we would do this on a milestone cadence, right? But I hadn't explicitly called that out anywhere. So, the idea of doing this work is simply to make it so you install some version of OLMD1, and then you can demo it and see what we did. And coincidentally, the new feature should be implemented per milestone at this phase. And so I had thought that we had a milestone, we update this distribution process to point to the new milestone, and we just do it per milestone. Now, if we want to do it at a more frequent or out of bound cadence, I think that's something we could discuss. But I'm curious if it makes sense for right now, just focusing on defining how we can package all this stuff together, and then maybe just having a soft requirement that as we close out releases, we cut, we go through this release process. Sorry, as we go through various milestones, we cut a release using this defined process.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the fact that we are at least anchoring ourselves around milestones and then talking about cutting releases around milestones, I think that itself gets us a structure, and that's what I was looking for. So I think I'm fine with it, at least till we go GA, and then when we go GA, then I think we can discuss that. What our structure will be after GA.
Something like that on it.
Yep.
And so just that. It just as a reminder, so whenever we have something that we know we're kind of pushing off to address in the future before our general availability, we create a issue against the GA milestone. And we just kind of call it like, hey, before we release, we have to address this issue. Does that make sense, everyone?
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, let's keep going through this. So anyways, we just went through this, making it easy for developers to cut an OLM release. Making it easy to cut an OLM v1 release will promote frequent releases and making it easy for users to install and test OLM v1 releases. Will promote adoption and make feedback. Make this strategy a little easier to read. And then some of the acceptance criteria that's going to come into this work. So OLM v1 milestone 1 can be installed using a single command line. So as we discussed with Joe, this is preferably interested just using a shell script. We run a shell script. And everything is installed correctly. So it looks like it is curl some URL.com or some.url/install. And it's all running good to go. We added that we could consider using how Ansible, Makefiles, or some other tool if they meet some unknown need, but we anticipate that we should be able to do this with a simple script. Any comments here? Cool. So the next bit is just making sure that OLM v1 developers can basically pin each component to a release. What does that look like? So, like the default thing here, like Joe had mentioned with the environment variables that you feed into the script, they will default to, whatever the latest versions are for that milestone release. But there might be points where you're like, hey, I want to install everything, but I want to use a local version of the operator controller. And so like being able to override which version of the component you're using would be nice. Any questions? Cool. Yeah, and add a benefit of being able to configure which components are being installed allows you to, within the operator controller, we can make some CI/CD thing that just updates the operator controller to the version that would result from the given PR, and then you can test it with the latest versions of everything else. So something to consider. Next bit. Some projects that we own should have a common GitHub release assets directory structure. So, as we cut a release of a sub-project, such as the operating controller or RucPack, we want to basically make sure that within the assets file for that GitHub release, there's a single YAML that you can use to apply the project to the cluster, and that way we have a consistent way of installing the latest version, and the script can rely on this consistent experience in order to install all the subcomponents. Any comments there? Okay, and this final ticket is just documenting our release process. So like Onyx said, we need to actually have commitment to cutting releases. For now, we're just going to cut a release whenever we finish a milestone, and then we are going to log that once we finish these frequent milestones, it may make sense to have an official release process in terms of how we cut releases for old minor versions that were released or major versions. and like what our commitment is there. How far back do we support, back forwarding bugs? Any questions? Okay, on that note, you have the link to it, so please, if there are any questions that you get, if you're reviewing this later and you come up with questions, please just remember you can highlight things and then highlight this, add a comment, and we can work on it the next time we meet up. Then we have our second rough milestone that we're going to do at the same time as that first milestone. And this one is like addressing existing DEPI shortcomings and supporting like OLM. All right, I'm not entirely sure how I want to like phrase this one, but I'll just call it DEPI improvements in supporting the new catalog source. So if you look at the defined user stories, we really have 4. So the first one focuses on like, hey, as an OLM v1 user, I would like to install an operator from a catalog source. That's pretty easy to go through and do. It may make sense to like specify, that we may want to install catalog, content from a registry v1 catalog source and a new, the new catalog source that Onik is working on. And the second set of stories, which are more DEPI focused, are as an OLM v1 user, I would like to install an operator at a specific version. As an OLM v1 user, I would like to install an operator that satisfies a version range constraint. So that, that's the version range constraint that we mentioned earlier. And then finally, as an OLM v1 user, I would like to specify a specific channel that an operator must come from. So these are like that, the DEPI stories, and then this is like the catalog source integration stories. Oh,
Is the DEPI resolution pipeline, which we discussed, I think the week before, a part of milestone 2B, or is it going to be something separate?
You're talking about the work Ankita has been doing.
The work which Per explained regarding the resolution pipeline in the form of a DAG graph, where we have processors, consumers, and producers.
Yeah, so I guess we prepare about that bit. I think we were going to focus on pulling in the generics bit first. And I don't know if that encompasses any of the pipeline bits with the consumers, producers, and I forget the third one you mentioned.
Okay.
But primarily, it's just like some DEPI improvements, introducing new constraints in that space, and then finally pulling stuff from on-cluster catalog sources.
Got it.
Cool. Which basically summarizes what I had described in the description. There are 2 primary goals of this milestone: address known shortcuts taken in the DEPI framework to expand the number of constraints that users may specify, and then finally kick off OLM v1 catalog source implementation and integration with OLM. With OLM v1. How's that look for everyone so far?
Sounds good to me.
Cool. So moving to generics. So Per has been working on introducing generics to the DEPI framework. We can call out right here. So Varsh in our stream, in our community meeting. Wonder if I can add Barsha. Nope. Barsha was curious if we will be moving to the proposed. This is the observability pipeline deputy work that you were referencing, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's the right word.
My gut is that's probably more work than we'll do in a, you know. Thought I spelled this right. I'm just gonna. Can't take it, but I'll fix that later. Cool. So other things we're going to do with deputy is introducing a version range and channel constraints. So we're adding fields to the operator controller API that allows users to specify a channel and a version range. We added a note that we use blank semper at v4 and OLM 0. We'll probably use that library again, but people should know that different implementations of the semper libraries have slightly different behavior. So whenever we do land on a library, we need to document our decision so that people have a source of truth to point to when they're defining SEM versions in their operator CR for the version range. We had a stretch goal. I guess it's, I don't know, less of a stretch goal and just something that we will want to do. So I'll move that. Actually, I'll set that. Replacing the hardcode entity list from Defi, and what this involves is using an on cluster catalog source to provide the entity list. Awesome. And then I think there's one more story that we wanted to add here. Or it could be a sub project. Update the operator. Cube CTL operator plugin to support the version range and channel constraints. Right. So this is the Cube CTL operator plugin allows users to specify the version range and channel constraints using flags. Yeah, we might also want to I don't know if we want to do this, but if we're going to allow people to express a variety of constraints with this kubectl plugin, it might be nice to be able to just provide it like a config map or a config file. Like too much Kubernetes talk. People think this is worth thinking about? Should we ask Joe about it later? Does anyone think this is a horrible idea?
I think that's reasonable because eventually we want the kubectl operator to create a valid operator object to trigger the controller. So whatever spec we have in the controller should somehow be an input to the kubectl operator's command line. So yeah.
We'll leave it there for now, and if people want to move it out, we can do that in the next iteration of this meeting. And now we get down to the OLMV1 catalog source acceptance criteria. And I didn't do much here. All I just said was that we were going to create the OLMV1 catalog source repository, and then you'll eventually be able to install an entity from an OLMV1 catalog source. So what does that mean? The operator controller no longer uses or feeds a hard-coded list of entities into Debbie. Operating controller queries for we'll go with that for catalog sources. Operating controller queries for so operating. Basically, we're getting rid of that hard-coded bit, and then we're going to query content from the ONSUS cluster catalog sources, which is similar. I guess this kind of overlaps actually with the hard-coded list is going to come from the operator controller, so we can believe this is part of the catalog source acceptance criteria. So the only stories we have defined for the catalog source bit is creating the repository and then, updating the operator controller to not use the hard-coded list. Anik, would you mind taking this as a to-do action to kind of start populating what stories you think you'd want to do in this milestone with the new OLMV1 catalog source API?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that we're also the top. We've also crossed the mark of
Yep.
but yeah, it makes sense since we are all still in the design phase, but we are getting close to getting close to a place where we want to start prototyping and implementation. So as that becomes a little bit more solidified, I'll start filling out these or this section. So whatever you have right now, I think it makes sense right now. And as we go along, as we know more, I can start filling out this section.
Very cool. Yeah. With that, we're over time, so I'm going to end the meeting. Does anyone have any last minute questions or comments before we adjourn for the day? All right. Well, then on that note, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your participation, and I will see you all next week.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Y'all have a good one. Bye.